They ordered him to strip right there in the palace courtyard, in full view of tourists filming from behind the gates. Humiliated, he stood half-dressed as the crowd watched. But when they reached for his trousers, he finally spoke. Just one word, no. At that moment, the palace commander burst onto the scene, took one look at the tattoo running down the guard's spine and stopped cold. What happened next changed everything. Before we reveal what unfolded, drop a comment, letting us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We share powerful stories like this every single day. Now, let's get back to what really happened. London's morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace like a shroud, and through that grey veil, tourists gathered in their usual clusters, cameras ready, voices hushed with anticipation. They came for the spectacle, the pageantry, the living statues in their scarlet tunics and towering bearskin hats. What they witnessed that morning would haunt them for years to come. Lance Sergeant James Brandt stood at his post with the precision of a man carved from stone. 28 years old, 6 feet 2 inches of disciplined muscle wrapped in ceremonial wool. He was the picture of British military tradition. His eyes, pale grey like winter steel, stared straight ahead, seeing everything while acknowledging nothing. The tourists pointed and whispered, snapping selfies with the motionless guard, treating him like an ornament rather than a human being. This was nothing new. Brandt had endured worse. But across the courtyard, Brigadier General Matthew Alston watched with different eyes. Alston was a man who had clawed his way up through the ranks, accumulating power like a collector hoarding rare coins. At 53, his face bore the hard lines of a career built on breaking others, and his uniform displayed enough medals to armor a small vehicle. He had noticed something about Brandt that others missed, the way the younger man carried himself with a quiet confidence that bordered on arrogance. It irritated Alston in ways he couldn't quite articulate. The morning inspection was supposed to be routine, a ceremonial walkthrough that reinforced the chain of command and maintained discipline. But as Alston approached Brandt's position, his polished boots clicking against the ancient stones, there was nothing routine about the predatory gleam in his eyes. The tourists sensed the shift in atmosphere, the way prey animals sense an approaching storm. Conversations died mid-camera flashes paused. Alston stopped directly in front of Brandt, so close that his breath fogged in the cool air between them. For a long moment, neither man moved. The brigadier began his slow circle, examining every button, every crease, every microscopic detail of Brandt's uniform with the intensity of a jeweler appraising a diamond. The crowd held its breath, sensing drama but not yet understanding its nature. Lance Sergeant Brandt. Alston's voice cut through the morning air like a blade, each syllable precisely enunciated and loaded with authority. Front and center, Brandt's response was immediate and flawless. 3 sharp steps forward, heels clicking together with military precision, eyes still fixed on some distant point beyond the palace walls. But those who looked closely might have noticed the almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes, the way his jaw set just a fraction harder than before. The inspection began with textbook protocol. Alston examined the alignment of Brandt's buttons, the polish on his boots, the angle of his cap. To the untrained eye, everything appeared perfect. But Alston was hunting for imperfection with the dedication of a man possessed. He found nothing, which only seemed to fuel his growing anger. Minutes stretched into an eternity of silence, broken only by the shuffle of tourist feet and the distant rumble of London traffic. Alston's examination grew more invasive, more personal. He checked the shine on Brandt's belt buckle with his white glove, examined the stitching on his uniform with a magnifying intensity that made the watching crowd uncomfortable. Then Alston found what he was looking for, or rather, what he decided to find. A microscopic speck of dust on Brandt's collar, invisible to anyone standing more than 2 feet away. In that moment, the brigadier's face transformed, a cruel smile spreading across his features like oil on water. Substandard uniform maintenance, Alston announced loudly enough for the growing crowd to hear. His voice carried the theatrical quality of a man who enjoyed his power and wanted everyone to witness its exercise. This is unacceptable for a member of the Queen's Guard. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Several tourists exchanged glances, sensing the injustice but powerless to intervene. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, asking in a whisper why the man in the fancy uniform was being mean to the soldier. The mother shushed him, but her eyes reflected the same discomfort that rippled through the assembled crowd. Brandt remained perfectly still, his breathing controlled and even. Those grey eyes never wavered, never acknowledged the provocation. This only seemed to enrage Alston further. He had expected submission, fear, some crack in that infuriating composure. Instead, he faced a wall of disciplined silence that mocked his authority. "Did you hear me, Lance Sergeant?" Alston's voice rose, his face flushing red beneath his peaked cap. "I said your uniform is substandard. What do you have to say for yourself?" The protocol was clear. Enlisted men were expected to acknowledge criticism from superior officers, to accept responsibility and promise improvement. But Brandt said nothing. His silence stretched across the courtyard like a challenge, and Alston accepted it with the fury of a man whose authority had been publicly questioned. That's when the brigadier made his fatal decision. "Strip," Alston commanded, his voice cutting through the morning air with the sharpness of broken glass. "Remove your tunic. Now." The word hit the crowd like a physical blow. Gasps rippled through the assembled tourists, phones suddenly appearing, as people began recording what they sensed would be either a scandal or a tragedy. A middle-aged woman covered her teenage daughter's eyes, while an elderly veteran in the crowd straightened his shoulders, his face hardening with disapproval. For the first time since the inspection began, Brandt's eyes moved. Just slightly, almost imperceptibly, they shifted to meet Alston's gaze. In that brief moment of eye contact, something passed between the two men, a wordless communication that seemed to drain the color from Alston's face before his anger reasserted itself. "I gave you an order, Lance Sergeant," Alston repeated, his voice now carrying a desperate edge that hadn't been there before. He was committed to his course of action, trapped by his own public challenge and unable to back down without losing face. "Remove your tunic or face charges of insubordination." The crowd murmured uneasily. This had gone far beyond military discipline and into the realm of public humiliation. Several people began lowering their cameras, suddenly uncomfortable with documenting what felt like a man's deliberate destruction, but others kept recording, drawn by the same morbid fascination that makes people slow down at accident scenes. Brandt's hands moved to his collar with the mechanical precision of a man following orders he found distasteful but would not resist. The first button came undone with a soft whisper of fabric. Then the second. Each movement was deliberate, controlled, professional, as if he were performing a drill rather than submitting to public humiliation. The scarlet tunic fell away, revealing the crisp white dress shirt beneath. But this wasn't enough for Alston, whose eyes now blazed with a cruel satisfaction that made several onlookers physically uncomfortable. He was enjoying this, feeding off the power to reduce a proud man to nothing more than an object of ridicule. "The shirt as well," Alston ordered, his voice dropping to a hiss that somehow carried across the silent courtyard. "All of it." This was when Major Richard Bell, who had been approaching from the palace's side entrance, broke into a run. Bell was a career soldier with 30 years of experience, a man who had served in 3 wars and knew the difference between discipline and sadism. What he was witnessing fell squarely into the latter category, but Bell was still 50 yards away. When Brandt began unbuttoning his dress shirt, the morning air was cool against Brandt's skin as the white cotton fell away from his shoulders. The crowd fell silent, not with anticipation but with a collective intake of breath that sounded like wind through autumn leaves. Because there, etched across the landscape of Brandt's back in black ink, so deep it seemed to absorb light, was a tattoo that told a story no one was prepared to read. The centerpiece was a viper, coiled and ready to strike, its scales rendered in such detail that they seemed to shift in the morning light. Through the snake's skull, a dagger thrust upward, its blade catching an artistic gleam that made the weapon appear three-dimensional. But it was the words beneath, inscribed in elegant Latin script, that would haunt the witnesses for years too. "Come, nec tempus, nec fatum," neither time nor fate. Yet even this dramatic imagery paled in comparison to the smaller details that surrounded it. Numbers, coordinates, initials, a grid of information so dense and precise that it resembled a military map more than body art. And along the left shoulder blade, a series of small marks that looked like tallies, dozens of them, arranged in neat rows that spoke of careful accounting. Alston stared at the tattoo with the expression of a man who had opened what he thought was a jewelry box, only to find a live grenade inside. His mouth opened and closed without sound, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and finally, abject terror. Because Brigadier General Matthew Alston, for all his accumulated medals and political maneuvering, had never seen real combat. He had never operated in the shadows where nations sent their most expendable assets to do their most unforgivable work. But he had heard whispers in the officers' club, rumors spoken in lowered voices about units that didn't officially exist, about men who disappeared from all records after completing missions that would never be acknowledged. The Viper tattoo was more than artwork. It was a memorial, a burial marker for the dead. And those coordinates etched into Brandt's skin weren't random numbers. They marked mass graves in places that didn't appear on any tourist map. Major Bell reached the scene just as Alston stumbled backward, his face the color of old parchment. Bell took one look at Brandt's exposed back and immediately understood the catastrophic nature of what had just occurred. His voice, when he spoke, carried the authority of a man who had actually earned his rank through blood rather than politics. "Brigadier, stand down. Now." The command echoed across the courtyard with enough force to make several tourists jump. But Alston seemed beyond hearing, his eyes still locked on the tattoo that had just shattered his understanding of the man he thought he was humiliating. The silence that followed Bell's command stretched across the courtyard like a held breath. Even the pigeons seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, ceasing their constant cooing and pecking. Brandt stood perfectly still, his back a canvas of secrets written in permanent ink, while around him the world tried to process what it was seeing. An elderly man in the crowd, wearing a Veterans Association badge on his civilian jacket, suddenly straightened to attention. His weathered hands trembled as he raised them in a salute, tears streaming down his cheeks. He didn't understand the specific meaning of the tattoo, but he recognized the posture of a warrior who had sacrificed everything for his country. One by one, other veterans in the crowd followed suit, creating a silent honor guard of recognition in the midst of what had been intended as public humiliation. Bell moved with the swift efficiency of a man trained to contain disasters. He grabbed Alston by the arm, his grip firm enough to leave bruises, and pulled him aside. Their conversation was conducted in harsh whispers, but the body language told the story clearly enough. Bell's controlled fury contrasting sharply with Alston's growing panic. "That man," Bell hissed into Alston's ear, "has more classified operations in his service record than you have days of active duty. His psychological profile is sealed at levels that require parliamentary approval to access. If word of this gets out, if his identity is compromised, people will die, and you, Brigadier, will be the first casualty." Alston's mouth worked soundlessly, his mind struggling to process the implications of what Bell was telling him. The Brigadier had built his career on intimidation and political maneuvering, but he was suddenly facing consequences that existed far beyond the comfortable world of military bureaucracy. Meanwhile, Brandt remained motionless, neither ashamed nor defiant. His breathing was controlled, his posture unchanged from when he had first taken his position hours earlier. The tattoo on his back told its story to anyone with eyes to see. But Brandt himself offered no explanations, no justifications, no acknowledgement of the drama swirling around him. A young woman in the crowd, perhaps 20 years old, and clearly American by her accent, whispered to her companion, "What does that tattoo mean?" Her friend, a British university student, shook his head slowly. "I don't think we're supposed to know," he replied, and something in his voice suggested he was beginning to understand the true weight of what they were witnessing. The morning sun had climbed higher during the confrontation, burning away the mist that had shrouded the palace grounds. In the clearer light, more details of Brandt's tattoo became visible. Small symbols that looked like military unit insignias, dates that corresponded to international incidents that had never been fully explained in the press, and most disturbing of all, a series of names written in script so small it was barely legible, except to anyone standing directly behind him. Bell finished his urgent conversation with Alston and approached Brandt with the careful respect one might show an unexploded ordnance. The Major had served long enough to recognize the kind of man who carried his wars on his skin, and he knew that such men were not created by accident or broken by ceremony. Lance Sergeant Bell said quietly, his voice carrying just far enough for Brandt to hear, "You may dress." For the first time since the ordeal began, Brandt moved, not quickly, not with any sense of urgency or relief, but with the same methodical precision that had characterized his undressing. He bent to retrieve his shirt, and as he did, the crowd caught a glimpse of his chest, another landscape of ink, though partially obscured by the angle. What they could see was enough to suggest that the tattoo on his back was merely one chapter in a much longer story, a story written in permanent ink across the geography of a man's body. Each mark a mile marker on a journey through places that existed in the shadows between nations. As Brandt pulled the white dress shirt over his shoulders and began fastening the buttons, a strange thing happened. The crowd began to clap. It started with the elderly veteran who had first saluted, a slow, measured applause that spoke of respect rather than entertainment. Others joined in, not all of them, and not with enthusiasm, but with the kind of recognition that comes when people realize they have witnessed something far more significant than they initially understood. Alston watched this spontaneous tribute with growing horror. What had begun as a simple exercise in authority had transformed into something that looked dangerously like a celebration of the man he had tried to humiliate. The brigadier could see his career evaporating before his eyes, could already imagine the headlines, the investigations, the quiet conversations in darkened offices that would decide his fate. Bell pulled out his phone and began making calls, not to the press to make sure there would be no press. His voice was urgent but controlled as he spoke to contacts in various government departments, activating protocols that most people didn't know existed. Within minutes, security personnel in civilian clothes began appearing at the edges of the crowd, politely encouraging tourists to delete their photos and videos, offering alternative tours of the palace grounds that would take them away from this particular courtyard. But they were too late. In the age of social media, information travels faster than official responses. Videos had already been uploaded, photos shared, hashtags created. The image of the tattooed guard was spreading across the internet like wildfire, and no amount of official pressure could contain it entirely. Brandt finished dressing with the same ceremony he had undressed, each button secured with military precision, each crease smoothed with professional care. When he was fully clothed again, he returned to his position without a word, resuming the motionless stance that had defined his mourning. But something had changed. The tourists who remained looked at him differently now, with a mixture of awe and uncertainty that hadn't been there before. The immediate aftermath of the incident played out like a carefully choreographed dance of damage control. Bell coordinated with palace security to manage the crowd, while Alston found himself effectively sidelined, his authority neutralized by the magnitude of his mistake. The brigadier stood off to one side, his face pale and drawn, watching his career implode in real time. A black sedan appeared at the palace gates, with the kind of prompt efficiency that suggested official involvement. Two men in expensive suits emerged, their bearing and demeanor marking them as government operatives rather than palace personnel. They approached Bell with urgent whispers and meaningful glances, clearly briefing him on developments that were happening far above the pay grade of anyone in uniform. Within the hour, the official story began to take shape. A training exercise had been conducted to test the psychological resilience of the Queen's Guard under unusual circumstances. The officer involved had exceeded his authority and would face appropriate disciplinary action. The guard in question had performed admirably under extraordinary pressure and would be commended for his professionalism. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic fiction, crafted with the kind of expertise that comes from decades of managing inconvenient truths. The story was disseminated through official channels, picked up by sympathetic media outlets, and gradually began to replace the more sensational narratives that had initially emerged from eyewitness accounts. But for those who had been present, who had seen Brandt's tattoo in all its terrible detail, the official explanation felt hollow. They had witnessed something that transcended military discipline or training exercises. They had glimpsed a truth that existed in the spaces between what governments acknowledged and what they actually did to protect their citizens. Brandt himself remained at his post throughout this orchestrated confusion, a pillar of stability in a world suddenly gone mad around him. Tourists still approached, still took photos, but their behavior had changed. Where before they had treated him as a curiosity, now they maintained a respectful distance. Children who might have previously tried to make him laugh now stayed close to their parents, sensing something in his stillness that discouraged casual interaction. That as the afternoon wore on, a steady stream of military personnel began arriving at the palace, not the ceremonial guards or administrative staff who normally populated such spaces, but men and women with the lean, alert look of active soldiers. They came individually or in small groups, never announcing their purpose. simply taking up positions around the courtyard where they could observe without interfering. These were Brandt's people, not his current unit. But the shadows he had emerged from word had spread through channels that didn't appear on any organizational chart, carried by men who understood the significance of what had happened. They came to bear witness, to ensure that one of their own was not left to face the consequences alone. The changing of the guard occurred at precisely 4 o'clock, as it had every day for centuries. But today, the ceremony carried an additional weight that was felt by everyone present. When Brandt's replacement approached, a young corporal barely out of training, the contrast between the two men was startling. Where Brandt carried himself with the controlled stillness of a predator at rest, the corporal displayed the rigid tension of someone desperately afraid of making a mistake. As Brandt stepped away from his post, the corporal whispered something, just a few words, barely audible to anyone more than a foot away. But Brandt's response, a slight nod and the briefest touch of his hand to the younger man's shoulder, conveyed a recognition that transcended rank or protocol. It was the acknowledgement of one warrior by another, a passing of responsibility that had nothing to do with ceremonial duty and everything to do with the kind of trust that is earned in places where trust means survival. Bell appeared at Brandt's side as he walked away from the palace, falling into step with the easy familiarity of men who had served together in harder places than this. Their conversation was quiet, conducted in the kind of military shorthand that conveyed maximum information with minimum words. "Transport is waiting," Bell murmured. "Safe house has been prepared. New identity documents will be ready within 48 hours. Brandt nodded without breaking stride. This was the protocol they had both hoped would never be necessary, the contingency plan that existed for exactly this kind of exposure. Within a week, Lance Sergeant James Brandt would officially die in a training accident. Within a month, a man with a different name and a carefully constructed background would appear somewhere else entirely, carrying the same skills but none of the visible reminders of how he had acquired them. The black sedan was waiting, just outside the palace grounds, its engine running and rear door already open. As Brandt approached the vehicle, he paused for a moment and looked back at the palace, at the tourists still milling around the courtyard, at the young corporal now standing rigid at his former post. For just an instant, something flickered across his face, not regret, exactly, but a kind of weary recognition that another chapter of his life was ending. The tattoo on his back would need to be altered or covered, the coordinates and names obscured by new artwork that would hide the truth beneath layers of deception. It was a small death, the erasure of memories that had been literally carved into his flesh. But as he slid into the sedan's leather interior, Brandt's expression returned to its characteristic neutrality. He was a man trained to adapt, to survive, to disappear when circumstances required it. The humiliation he had endured that morning was already becoming just another memory to be filed away, another experience to be learned from and then forgotten. Sedan pulled away from the curb with the smooth efficiency of a vehicle that belonged to people who valued discretion above comfort. Within minutes, it had disappeared into London's afternoon traffic, carrying its passenger toward a future that would be built on the careful destruction of his past. The ripple effects of that morning's incident continued to spread through channels both official and unofficial. In a windowless conference room deep within Whitehall, men and women with titles that appeared on no public directory gathered to assess the damage and coordinate their response. The meeting was off the books, as was the unit they were discussing, as were the operations that had necessitated the Purse unit's existence in the first place. The woman chairing the meeting was in her 50s, with a kind of understated appearance that made her instantly forgettable, a crucial skill in her line of work. She had been managing assets like Brandt for over 2 decades, shepherding them through missions that would never be acknowledged and helping them disappear when their usefulness was exhausted. "Asset Viper 7 has been compromised," she announced. Without preamble, facial recognition software has already flagged him in 6 different international databases. His cover identity is blown, and by extension, so are the operations he was involved in. Around the table, her colleagues absorbed this information with the professional detachment of people who dealt in human lives as currency. They were already calculating the broader implications, identifying which operations would need to be shut down, which assets would need to be relocated, which allies would need to be briefed on the security breach. What about the officer who initiated the exposure? asked a man with the accent of someone educated at schools that didn't advertise their existence. "Brigadier Alston, according to the files. He's being handled," the woman replied. "Career termination, followed by relocation to a position where his knowledge of this incident will be irrelevant. He'll finish out his service, counting paper clips in some remote supply depot, assuming he survives the psychological pressure of knowing what he's cost his country." The discussion that followed was conducted in the cool, analytical language of professionals discussing a business problem rather than the destruction of human lives. They spoke of asset management and operational security and acceptable losses, carefully avoiding terms that might remind them of the human cost of their decisions. Meanwhile, in a safe house located in an unremarkable suburb 40 minutes outside London, Brandt sat in a kitchen chair while a man with surgeon's hands worked on his back. The process of altering the tattoo was painstaking, requiring the careful application of new ink over old to obscure the coordinates and names while preserving the artistic integrity of the original design. The work would take several sessions to complete, each one carefully spaced to allow for healing. By the time it was finished, the viper would remain, but the map of graves would be gone, replaced by decorative elements that would satisfy casual observers without revealing the truth to those who knew how to read the signs. "This is going to hurt," the artist warned, preparing his needles with the methodical care of a man who understood that his work needed to be perfect the first time. Brandt's response was a slight shrug, the gesture of a man for whom physical pain had long since ceased to be a meaningful concern. He had endured worse than needles in service of his country, had carried burdens heavier than the secret on his back. A few hours of deliberate discomfort seemed like a small price to pay for the opportunity to disappear once again into the shadows, where he belonged. As the needle began its work, Brandt closed his eyes and let his mind drift back to the morning's events. He found himself thinking not about Alston or Bell or the political machinations that were even now reshaping his future, but about the young corporal who had taken his place at the palace. 3 months later, Corporal Davies stood at the same post where Brandt had once maintained his vigil. The young soldier had grown into the role, his initial nervousness replaced by the kind of steady confidence that comes from routine mastery. Tourists still took photos, children still tried to make him laugh, and he endured it all with the professional patience that had become second nature. But sometimes, late at night, when the palace grounds were empty and his shift was nearly over, Davies would think about the morning he had witnessed a man's destruction and resurrection. He never spoke of what he had seen. Military discipline and official warnings had ensured his silence, but the memory remained vivid in his mind like a scene from a half-remembered dream. The official story had done its work. The incident was remembered, when it was remembered at all, as a training exercise that had gotten out of hand. Brigadier Alston had been quietly transferred to an administrative position in Scotland, his rapid departure explained by the need for experienced officers in remote postings. The videos that had briefly circulated online had been overwhelmed by more current scandals and forgotten by all but the most dedicated conspiracy theorists. Yet in certain circles, the story persisted. Veterans would sometimes speak of it in lowered voices, sharing details that had never appeared in any official report. They talked about the tattoo, about the coordinates and names that had been visible for just a few moments before being hidden again. They speculated about what kind of service would mark a man in such a way, what kind of missions would require such permanent reminders of temporary victories. A few particularly dedicated researchers had attempted to decode the coordinates they claimed to remember, plotting them on maps and trying to correlate them with unexplained incidents in the locations they indicated. But their efforts had been frustrated by the sheer impossibility of their task. The coordinates had been visible for mere minutes, captured in shaky cell phone videos that had been deleted almost as quickly as they were posted. The man himself had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. James Brandt's military records showed a training accident that had occurred for days after the palace incident, a routine exercise gone wrong that had claimed the life of a promising young soldier. The funeral had been private, attended only by military personnel who maintained their silence with the discipline of professionals who understood the cost of loose tongues. But in a small pub in Edinburgh, a man who might have been Brandt occasionally appeared for a quiet drink and a game of darts. He called himself Michael Craignow, claimed to be a security consultant for insurance companies, and displayed the kind of low-key competence that made him instantly forgettable to casual observers. His back, when glimpsed through an accidentally unbuttoned shirt, showed the artistic remnants of a tattoo that might once have told a different story. The viper was still there, coiled and ready to strike, but the dagger now appeared to be emerging from stylized flames rather than piercing a skull. The Latin motto remained unchanged, nec tempus, nec fatum, but the coordinates and names had been replaced by decorative scrollwork that added to the tattoo's artistic impact while revealing nothing of its original meaning. Sometimes, late in the evening when the pub was nearly empty and the conversation had turned to the kind of philosophical topics that emerged from the bottom of whiskey bottles, someone would ask Michael Craig about his tattoo. His response was always the same, a slight smile and a change of subject that discouraged further inquiry without seeming rude. The secret remained buried, as such secrets always did, in the space between what people knew and what they were allowed to understand. The palace guards continued their ancient ritual. Tourists continued to gawk and photograph, and the machinery of government continued to function with the smooth efficiency of an organization that had learned to manage its contradictions. And, in the shadows where such men belonged, the work continued, invisible, unacknowledged, and absolutely necessary for the preservation of a world that could afford to remain ignorant of the prices paid for its security. The viper might have shed its skin, but it had not forgotten how to strike when the moment required it. The story had ended where it began, with silence and duty, and the kind of sacrifice that could never be properly rewarded because it could never be properly acknowledged. In the end, that was enough. It had to be.